ready for takeoff.
Welcome to Educa TV, the #1 educational program in Denver. Direct from Denver, Colorado's DPS TV Comcast Channel 22, this is Educa TV. Ready for takeoff in 3, 2, 1.
And welcome to Educa TV. I'm your host, Salvador Carrera, and this is your co-host,
Julieta Quiñones, and we invite you to join the conversation either by asking questions or sending us your comments via text message at 720-961-3775. You can also visit our Facebook page at Educa Radio Denver. Once again, send us your comments and questions via text message at 720-961-3775 or find us on Facebook as Educa Radio Denver.
Today's show is going to give you an overview of how schools in Colorado are funded and what that means for our schools, our students, and our future. Denver Public Schools is projected to continue to receive less funding per student in 2016-2017 than 7 years ago, when our state already hovered near the bottom nationally in per pupil funding. This means significant challenges to Denver Public Schools and for all Colorado districts. As a result, we're exploring the potential to seek additional funding in the form of a 2016 bond and mill levy override in November of 2016. That's why we've invited today's guest, Dustin Kress. He's the manager of the bond and mill levy programs for Denver Public Schools. Welcome to Educa TV.
Thank you for having me here today.
Dustin, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So, as Sal mentioned, I'm the manager of bond and mill levy programs for DPS. And what that means is I have a pretty cool job to make sure that we as a district are taking in taxpayer dollars and using them well to the benefit of Denver's students.
Very well, Dustin. What's the most valuable thing that your education has left you with in your life?
That's a great question. I've been fortunate enough throughout the course of my educational career to have some really great educators, whether it was Mr. Mesco teaching Latin in high school or Professor Zach teaching accounting in college. Latin and accounting are not always easy or exciting subjects to learn, and yet these two educators really brought them to life and they made it fun. And so I really took away from that if you're doing something that you're passionate about, that everything else falls into place and it's fun. And you know, that link to passion is how I found myself involved in the education space.
Dustin, how long have you been working for Denver Public Schools and why public education?
Yeah, so I started with Denver Public Schools in 2008, and I was teaching at Merrill Middle School, 8th grade math. Merrill Middle School is a very unique school with a lot of newcomers and refugees to the United States, and it's just an awesome place to be able to connect with those students and being able to teach math. Math is a universal language. And while a lot of the students are struggling through the hardship of learning a new language and acclimating to a new country, math is actually a place where they can feel confident and get the grounding. So I really enjoyed my time looking back on Merrill. I moved to this position now, manager of bond and mill levy, about 3 years ago. And this position connects me a little bit with my business background that I had in college. And I think it's just an extrapolation of the work that I did with Merrill, but now focusing on the whole district to make sure that we're using these funds, these limited funds that we have, to the best benefit of our students.
Dustin, how are our schools funded? Can you answer that for us?
Well, it's a complicated question, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. In general, DPS, like other districts in Colorado, our funding is dictated by the School Finance Act at the state of Colorado. The School Finance Act gives districts throughout Colorado money on a per pupil or a per student basis. So if we receive more students enrolling in DPS, then we get more money. There's a base per pupil amount that DPS and all other schools get, and then there are a couple other factors, such as a cost of living increase, whereas it's more expensive to operate a school in Denver than it might be in rural Colorado. There are other different factors also, such as an at-risk increase, where if you have more at-risk students, you're going to receive some additional funds to serve them.
So Dustin, will it be fair to say that the funding follows the student?
Correct, it
Okay.
does.
So Dustin, what is the state of K-12 funding education in Colorado, and how does that impact our students?
The state of funding it's difficult right now. In 2008, 2009, Colorado, along with the rest of the U.S., had a pretty significant recession. And at that time, the state legislature in Colorado created what was known as a negative factor. So I talked about funding factors before. So you build up based on the number of students you have, whether you get a cost of living increase, whether you get an at-risk increase. And then this negative factor actually decreased the total funding that DPS and Colorado students were getting overall. And that negative factor hasn't gone away, even though we're 6-7 years out of the recession now. Estimates are that the negative factor impacts DPS approximately $1,000 per student per year. And so DPS is a district of 90,000 students, and so that means we get impacted $90 million a year.
Excellent. Thank you, Dustin. We're going to take a short break, but first Julieta is going to tell us how our viewers can participate in this conversation.
Of course, we invite you to join the conversation either by asking questions or comments via our Facebook page. You can find us on Educa Radio Denver, or you can also send us a text message at 720-961-3775. We want to hear from you.
When we return, we're going to continue to learn more about the Bond and Mill Levy 2016 and how our schools are funded. In the meantime, enjoy this special DPS features by Ben McKee.
Hey Denver, since we're all about education in Denver public schools, we wanted to share a quick lesson about Denver schools and how they're funded. We'll call it School Funding 101. This isn't algebra, we promise. Okay, first, it's good to know how the Denver public schools get funding. DPS receives about half of its funding from Denver property taxes. Most of the rest comes from the state of Colorado and the federal government. We'll dive into those soon, but first, let's look at how Colorado's education funding compares to other states. Colorado ranks near the bottom of the country in terms of education funding, at 42nd out of 50 states. And our state spends about 25% less per student than the national average. That's like students across the United States getting 4 cookies, while Colorado students only get 3 cookies. Take into account all the students in DPS, and that difference in cookies, or school funding, adds up real fast. DPS students received less funding than they did at the height of the Great Recession in 2009. Why is that? Let's zoom back into Colorado. The state legislature sets levels for education funding with the School Finance Act. Within that, a formula distributes how much money each school district gets on a per-student basis. But back in 2009, at the height of the Great Recession, the legislature changed the formula, cutting funds for all state school districts. This change is called the negative factor, and it's just one of the complicated factors that has caused Colorado to continue to underfund our schools, about $1,000 less than they did in 2009. Add up all the DPS students across our city, that's about $90 million less than DPS would have received under the previous state funding formula. Money that would otherwise hire more teachers, provide more programs, and help toward our big goal, that every child succeeds. So, to recap, DPS gets most of its funding from local property taxes, the state, and the government. Colorado ranks 42nd in the country in terms of education funding. The negative factor is just one of the complicated factors that has caused Colorado to continue to underfund our schools. It's contributing to much lower levels of education funding, about $90 million less every year. Money that could otherwise hire teachers, purchase materials, and support programs. To learn more, visit bond.dpsk12.org.
And welcome back. I hope you found that video very informative. In our studios, we have Dustin Kress. He's the manager for Bond and Mill Levy programs for Denver Public Schools, and he's going to continue to share with us information about school funding and Bond and Mill Levy. But first, Julieta, could you share with our audience and viewers how they can participate in this conversation.
Of course, so we want to hear from you. Please send us your questions and or comments via text message at 720-961-3775. Or you can also send us your message via our Facebook page. You can find us as Educa Radio Denver.
So we're back to our interview. And Dustin, the next question, I'm sure a lot of people are asking the same question. What's the difference between a bond and mill levy override?
Yeah, so it's in my title, and it still took me a while to understand all the differences, but it doesn't have to be that complicated. At its most basic form, a bond helps us build stuff, so buildings and infrastructure, and then a mill levy helps us bring those to life. So bond is one-time stuff, and mill levies help us bring those to life every year with teachers, tutors, arts programs, and other things to make sure that students are getting the best learning possible within those buildings.
So is bond, aside from building new buildings, does that include renovations to existing buildings?
Exactly, Julieta. So as a district, we have about 175 facilities. Many of them are beautiful, old, and historic, but old buildings require renovations and maintenance. And so bonds help us as a district make sure that those are still good, safe, and modern learning environments for our students.
And I'm assuming that would include like some sort of air conditioning in the classrooms that need it.
It does include kind of temperature moderation, so both heating and cooling.
Very good. Dustin, how has Denver used the bond and mill levy overrides in the past?
Yeah, so Denver voters were very generous to DPS in 2012 in passing both a bond and a mill levy override. In 2012, we used the bond, again, bonds being buildings and stuff, to build several new schools. Denver's a growing city, and so we needed to build new classrooms to meet students where they were moving in and were being born. I already mentioned our older buildings, and so the 2012 bond has been very crucial to make sure that we're maintaining those older buildings. We invested $200 million in maintenance and renovations to make sure that our kids are going to school in buildings that are, like I said, safe, functional, and modern.
So this was in 2012. Dustin, what does this mean for 2016?
Yeah, so we already talked a little bit in the first segment about the tough funding situation that we're experiencing in the state of Colorado. Because the outlook on Colorado funding is pretty kind of troubling and challenging going forward, DPS is looking for other ways that we can bring in revenue. And so right now we are considering asking voters for a potential bond and mill levy in this November 2016.
Very good. I've been impressed with some of the citizens that I've talked to about the upgrades and the renovations and stuff. From what I understand, a lot of the high schools benefited from this 2012 bond mill levy. They're very proud of their track and field. And I understand that about 15 high schools got brand new track and field.
A lot of high schools got new athletic turf. And I know West High School is really one of our historic Cardinal high schools, built in 1925. Beautiful from the outside. On the inside, it looked like it was built in 1925. And so, West High School is an example, but they got a new pool and renovations to their auditorium, upgraded science labs and robotics labs. And those are things that without a bond, DPS wouldn't be able to bring those capital investments for our students.
Very well. Dustin, we're going to take a break and we're going to come back and talk more about this. But first, Julieta, can you tell us again about our viewership and how they can participate in this conversation?
Of course, send us a text message with your comments or questions at 720-961-3775 or find us on Facebook as Educa Radio Denver.
We're going to take a break. We'll return, but in the meantime, enjoy this special DPS features reel by Ben McKee.
Hey Denver, you've probably heard these words before, bond and mill levy. So what are they? Both are types of funding drawn from property taxes. During an election, Denver voters can choose whether to approve them. But what's the difference between a bond and mill levy? Put simply, a bond builds classrooms, while a mill levy brings them to life. Let's start with a bond. DPS has 85 school facilities that are 65 years old or older. Bond funding helps renovate those schools, updating them for 21st century learning. It also builds brand new school buildings and buys existing buildings for new schools. Now, to understand a mill levy, let's zoom into one of these classrooms. This one belongs to Mrs. Carver. DPS uses mill levy funds to hire more teachers like Mrs. Carver. Mill levy funding also pays for new classroom technology, along with new textbooks and materials. It even creates arts and PE opportunities, enriching students' lives with classes like photography and dance. Mill levy funding is for every school across Denver, and it looks different at every school. So, to recap, a bond builds classrooms, and a mill levy brings them to life. Got it? Good. Get more at bond.dpsk12.org.
And welcome back. In our studios, we have Dustin Kress. He's the manager for the bond and mill levy programs for Denver Public Schools. And he's going to continue to share with us information about school funding and the bond and mill levy. Julieta, again, tell us how can our audience participate in this program?
Of course, so we want to hear from you. So please send us your comments or questions via text message at 720-961-3775. Or you can also find us on Facebook as Educa Radio Denver, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Julieta. Dustin, back to our questions. Can you give our viewers a little recap of what we've covered so far?
Yeah, so far we started off by talking about the funding situation that schools in Colorado are facing and how we're really in a little bit of a bind because of a negative factor that the state of Colorado has instituted that has cut education funding by about $1,000 per student. We also talked about alternative ways that districts can fund local education, such as bond and mill levy, to support their local students.
Dustin, we know that the legalization of marijuana probably brought in a lot of questions from our community. What can you tell us about the legalization of marijuana in our state? And didn't this help fund our schools?
That's a great question, Julieta, and it's one that we get all the time. There's this popular misconception that after the legalization of marijuana, all schools in Denver are just flush with extra marijuana tax revenue, and that's unfortunately not true. Since the legalization of marijuana, DPS has received no funds from state marijuana taxes. And the reason for that is that those state marijuana taxes are targeted at more rural areas in the state that can't afford to pass bonds to build new schools and renovate old schools like Denver can. And so because of that targeting, DPS has received no state marijuana tax dollars. There are City of Denver marijuana tax dollars, and Denver has received some of those to support after-school programming as well as summer programming, but that amounts to about $1 per student across the whole district. And so if you compare that to the $1,000 per student negative factor, it's not really helping us close the gap.
Dustin, we talked about some of the benefits that the district saw in 2012. What are some other things that impacted Denver Public Schools as a result of the 2012 bond mill levy?
That's a great question. So we haven't really had as much chance to dig into the mill levy and what that has meant for our students. The mill levy funded a couple of marquee programs that are really tremendously exciting. One of the big investments within the mill levy was around early childhood education. Because of our challenging state funding right now, the state of Colorado is not funding education for 3- and 4-year-olds, and so we have to seek out alternative ways to fund that, either through partner nonprofits such as the Denver Preschool Program, or through parent tuition, which is where we get a lot of money from right now. And so through the help of the mill levy, we introduced 800 more ECE scholarships, early childhood education scholarships, for 3- and 4-year-olds in areas of the city with the most need. So that's great that those students are getting their education early, getting on track early, so that then when they get into kindergarten, they're on track and they're ready to go. Another great program, speaking of getting kids on track, is the Denver Math Fellows program. This is a small group math tutoring that started in far northeast Denver, and we saw some really great results with it. And so as a result of the mill levy, we've been able to scale that program across all of the district. And the program looks like small group tutoring, where you get a math fellow and 3 to 4 students, and you can really dig into some of those foundational math skills that can't always get remediated during class time. And so students are getting regular class time in addition to out of class time tutoring to help them build up those base skills and get back on track for math.
We have seen great benefits from the Denver Math Fellows, and actually it's expanded to Denver Math and Literacy Fellows.
Correct.
And I think I can say that we've seen increases in math scores as a result of these extra programs that wouldn't be around if we didn't have this extra funding.
Absolutely. We would not be able to have scaled that without the mill levy, and we've seen great scores, as well as anecdotes from our math teachers, from our math students, and from our parents about kids feeling more excited about learning math.
And I understand there's also some physical ed activities and some art activities that, you know, those are the first things that are cut when we don't have enough funding. But as a result of this extra funding, we have been able to bring those programs back.
Thanks for bringing that up. As a result of the recession and the cuts to education funding, we were seeing some cuts to arts and PE programs as schools were faced with some really difficult trade-offs. With the help of the 2012 mill levy, we've been able to restore those cuts and actually add arts and PE opportunities for our students.
Very well. We're going to take another break. We're going to come back and talk more about the bond mill levy override. Julieta, can you tell us one more time how our audience can participate with this program?
Of course. Send us a text message with your comments or questions at 720-961-3775 or find us on Facebook as Educa Radio Denver.
Well, we're going to take a break. We're going to be right back. In the meantime, enjoy this special DPS features reel from Ben McKee.
Hey Denver, it's time for a game called Fact or Myth. Here we go. Fact or myth. Denver public schools get a significant amount of funding from marijuana taxes. This one, it's a myth. But didn't the legalization of marijuana in Colorado help schools? Yes, it does. During the first couple of years of legalization, Colorado received nearly $27 million in state-level marijuana excise taxes. That goes into a pool of funds like proceeds from the lottery and the sale of state land. That money supports schools across our state. However, that $27 million in state funding primarily supports schools and districts in rural parts of the state, as well as school districts without local bond support. In the 2 years since legalization, Denver public schools have received no funding from state marijuana taxes. In addition, the city of Denver collects taxes on marijuana sales, which mostly support a variety of after-school and summer educational activities. DPS receives about $1 per student from these city sources. So, to recap, marijuana taxes do help many school districts across our state. However, Denver public schools do not get a significant amount of funding for marijuana taxes. To learn more, visit bond.dpsk12.org.
And we're back in our studios with Dustin Kress. He's the manager for bond and mill levy programs for Denver Public Schools. And we're going to wrap up this last segment with some talk about the CPAC. CPAC, what does that mean, and what have they done so far, and how can parents get involved with CPAC?
Yeah, so CPAC stands for Citizens Planning Advisory Committee, and this is a group that was established in February 2016 to make recommendations to the Board of Education on what to include in a potential 2016 bond and mill levy. You know, we talked about our tough financial situation, and we talked about how bond and mill levy can help alleviate that at the local level. And given that DPS is considering asking voters for a 2016 bond and mill levy, but we wanted this to be a community process. It's not just DPS. This is about the city of Denver and how we feel about education. And so CPAC is a group of parents, teachers, students, community leaders from all across the city, about 70 people altogether, and they're charged with ultimately assessing, what are the needs of our students of Denver, and how can we structure some investments that would help best meet those needs and accelerate our progress towards our Denver Plan academic goals. So the CPAC has been meeting from February 2016 to now, and they're actually getting to the point where they're making some tough trade-offs. Even with new money, there's still a constrained amount that we can invest in, and so this group has to wrestle with some tough trade-offs, both on the bond and on the mill levy, about what's most going to impact the students of Denver. And so over the next coming weeks, they're going to be finalizing those. They've been working for months now, and in May, they're going to kind of formalize those recommendations and then bring those recommendations to the Board of Education in June. And I believe you asked a question about how to get involved, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I think that's extremely important, because we tried to develop a committee that is representative of the city of Denver, but we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to get involved. And so there are a number of public comment opportunities where people can come in front of the CPAC and advocate for specific programs at their school or specific investments in their school community. You can also go on our website. If you Google CPAC Denver, you'll be able to find a list of all the members who are on the committee. Please find the person who's on the committee from your community and go and talk to them and share how you will feel.
Dustin, as a community member or as a parent, why should I attend these public comment meetings? Will my voice be heard?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is extremely important to where we are going as DPS, and parents are most connected to their students' education, and so they have a great perspective on what the needs are. They're going to help us accelerate where we're moving.
I wanted to add that because I'm director for the language services side of things, I know that you are inclusive of Spanish-speaking community members, and they've been at the meetings. I understand there's been something like 22 different meetings with the subcommittee meetings and all that, and I know that a lot of this material has been translated into Spanish, and you've also had interpreters there, so it is a community-wide effort.
Yes, and thank you for your team for helping us make this inclusive process, because being inclusive, that's representative of where we are as a district in the city.
Very well. So we're getting close to the end of the program, and I wanted to use the remainder of the time for you just to give a final message to our audience, our parents, our students, our teachers that are watching now.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to harken back to the impact of 2012 that it has had on the city of Denver. Because of the recession, DPS was in a very challenging financial position, and the bond and mill levy that the voters of Denver passed in 2012 has allowed us to maintain and expand programs that have really impacted student achievement. And without that, we would have been in a difficult situation. But with that, we've been able to grow some really great programs that have meant a lot to our students.
If our parents want more information, do we have a website or someplace they can go to get more information, and maybe they can actually see some of the stuff that the district has benefited as a result of the 2012?
So if you go to bond.dpsk12.org, you will see an interactive map about where all of the bond and mill levy investments have gone in 2012. And so you can find your school, you can find what high school you'll end up going to, and see where all that money has flowed and what it has meant for our schools.
Will they be able to drill down by neighborhood and see what bond dollars were used in their neighborhood?
By neighborhood, yep. And by neighborhood and school.
Excellent. Yeah. That's excellent. Well, Dustin, that's all the time we've got. I wanted to thank you. We're lucky to have you in the position that you're in, so that you can manage and steward those projects, and not just what we've done since 2012, but all the work that needs to be done for November of 2016.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for having me.
We're gonna thank you for tuning in, and remember, tell your child more often, I believe in you, and I know you can do it.